I stood in my designer coat on the deck of the lakehouse as bulldozers tore through the white silk draping of what was supposed to be my brother's wedding tomorrow. The industrial floodlights cut through the midnight darkness like surgical knives, and I watched my mother drop to her knees in the mud, mascara streaming down her face as she screamed my name. My brother Mark lunged toward me, but Daniel's security guard caught him mid-stride, slamming him against the hood of a police car. The officers were reading my father his rights for fraud and identity theft. Everything they had built their shallow lives upon was crumbling in real time, and I felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of watching a house of cards finally collapse. If you want to hear how a doormat became the architect of her family's destruction, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story gets so much darker before it gets light. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done in my position. Now let me take you back to where this all started. My name is Lotus Chen, and for 28 years I believed that love meant sacrifice. I believed that family meant enduring. I believed that if I just worked hard enough, gave enough, bled myself dry enough, eventually they would see my worth. I was wrong about everything. I grew up in what looked like the perfect upper-middle-class family in the suburbs outside New York City. My father, Robert, ran a consulting firm. My mother, Evelyn, volunteered at charity galas and posted Instagram photos of our carefully curated family dinners. My older brother, Mark, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the heir apparent to everything. My sister Sarah was the princess, beautiful and charming and cruel in the way that pretty girls learn to be when the world tells them their looks are currency. Then there was me, the middle child, the one who got good grades but not exceptional ones, the one who was pretty enough but not stunning, the one who tried so hard to earn scraps of approval that I didn't notice I was eating from the dog bowl while they feasted at the table. When I was 19, my grandfather died. He left me the lake house on Lake Marlow, a beautiful old timber lodge that had been in our family for 3 generations. It was the only place I had ever felt peace. My grandfather used to take me fishing there when I was little before Mark monopolised his attention. In his will, he wrote that he left it to me because I was the only one who understood that some things are worth more than money. My parents were furious but hid it behind tight smiles. The house was worth maybe $400,000 at the time, nothing compared to the other assets that were divided up. But it was mine. The deed was in my name. That detail would matter later. I went to college for accounting, not because I loved numbers, but because it was practical, because I could get a job and help the family. That was always the unspoken expectation. Mark went to business school on my parents' dime. Sarah got a luxury apartment near NYU for her fashion merchandising degree. I got a partial scholarship and worked 3 jobs to cover the rest because there was never quite enough money left over for me. After graduation, I landed a position at a mid-sized firm in Manhattan. The pay was decent, but not great. I lived in a shoebox apartment in Queens with 2 roommates and took the subway an hour each way to work. Meanwhile, Mark moved back home rent-free while he got his startup off the ground. Sarah bounced between jobs and boyfriends and always had her hand out for emergency funds. It started slowly. My mother called one day asking if I could help with Mark's business expenses just until his first round of funding came through. $5,000. I sent it because that's what good daughters do. Then it was Sarah's car payment. Then the country club dues because networking was important for Dad's business. Then Mark's startup failed, and suddenly there was $20,000 in debt that somehow had my name attached to it. I didn't understand how that was possible until I checked my credit report 2 years later when I tried to apply for a car loan. There were 3 credit cards I had never opened, student loans I had never taken out, a home equity line of credit against the lake house that I had never authorised. My credit score was 512. I had been working 70-hour weeks, living like a monk, saving every penny, and on paper, I looked like a financial disaster. When I confronted my father, he barely looked up from his laptop. He told me it was complicated, that the family had needed help, that I should be grateful they had raised me, and this was the least I could do. When I said what they did was illegal, he said, "Family doesn't call lawyers on family." My mother cried and said I was being selfish. Mark laughed and said I was being dramatic over some paperwork. I backed down. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. I took on extra freelance work to try to pay down debt that wasn't even mine. I skipped meals. I didn't buy new clothes. I cancelled plans with friends because I couldn't afford to go out. I disappeared into my work and my shame, believing somehow this was my fault for not being successful enough to cover everyone's needs. The lakehouse became my escape. Once a month I would drive the 2 hours north and spend the weekend there alone. I would sit on the deck and watch the sunset over the water and remember my grandfather's weathered hands teaching me to tie fishing knots. The house was old and needed repairs, but it was mine. It was the only thing in my life that felt solid. Then came Mark's engagement party. He was marrying Vanessa Whitmore, the daughter of a major commercial real estate developer. It was the kind of match my parents had dreamed of. Old money meeting new ambition. The engagement party was held at the Gramercy, a restaurant where appetizers cost $40. The invitation said, black tie optional. I worked a double shift that day because a client had an emergency audit. I arrived late in my work clothes, a rumpled blazer and slacks I had worn for 14 hours straight. The hostess looked at me like I had wandered in from the street. Inside the room glittered crystal chandeliers and ice sculptures and women in gowns that cost more than my monthly rent. I spotted my family at the centre table surrounded by Vanessa's relatives and my parents' business associates. I made my way over, apologising for being late. My mother's eyes went cold the second she saw me. She stood up abruptly, grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and pulled me toward the coat check area. For a moment I thought she was going to hug me, tell me she was glad I made it despite my crazy work schedule. Instead, she leaned close and spoke in a voice just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. She told me I was an embarrassment, that she had specifically said not to come if I couldn't dress appropriately, that they had only invited me out of respect for my late grandfather, otherwise I would have been left off the guest list entirely, that I was making the whole family look bad. She said these words with a smile frozen on her face like she was complimenting my hair. I felt my face burn. People were staring. I tried to explain about work, about not having time to go home and change, but she cut me off. She told me to sit in the back and not to draw attention to myself. Then she glided back to the main table where my father was schmoozing with Vanessa's parents. I found a chair in the corner behind a decorative column. A waiter brought me a glass of water, probably assuming I was staff. I sat there for 2 hours watching my family perform their successful, sophisticated, loving family routine while I tried to become invisible. Then Mark stood up to make a toast. He thanked everyone for coming. He gushed about Vanessa and how she was the love of his life. He talked about building a future together. And then he said it. He announced that after the wedding, he and Vanessa would be renovating and moving into the beautiful timber lodge on Lake Marlow as a gift from his parents, their forever home, the place where they would raise their future children. The room erupted in applause. Vanessa kissed him. My mother dabbed at her eyes like she was crying tears of joy. My father shook hands with Vanessa's father, probably sealing some business deal at the same time. I sat frozen behind that column, gripping my water glass so hard I thought it might shatter. The lakehouse, my lakehouse. The only thing my grandfather had left me. The only thing that was supposed to be mine. They were announcing to 200 people that they were taking it like it was already decided. Like I didn't exist. Like my ownership was just an inconvenient technicality. Sarah caught my eye from across the room. She smiled and mouthed something that looked like, "You don't mind, right?" Then she laughed and turned away. I left without saying goodbye to anyone. I walked out into the cold March night and threw up in a trash can on Fifth Avenue. Then I walked for miles through the city until my feet blistered trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't just the house, it was the casual cruelty of it. The public humiliation. The absolute certainty they had that I would roll over and let them take whatever they wanted, because I always had before. When I got home at 3 a.m, I pulled out every document related to my finances, bank statements, credit reports, loan paperwork, the deed to the lake house. I laid it all out on my apartment floor and really looked at it for the first time. The scope of what they had done was staggering. They hadn't just borrowed money in my name. They had systematically stripped me of any financial independence. They had forged my signature dozens of times. They had used my social security number to open accounts and then max them out. In any other context, this would be called identity theft. But because it was family, I had let it happen. I thought about calling them, demanding an explanation, begging them to at least ask me before announcing they were taking my property. But I knew how that would go. My mother would cry. My father would lecture me about family loyalty. Mark would call me jealous and petty. Sarah would roll her eyes and tell me to get over myself. They would gaslight me into believing I was the problem, just like they always did. So instead, I called Daniel Park. We had gone to college together, lived in the same dorm freshman year. He had asked me out a few times back then, but I was too busy working to date much. We had stayed loosely in touch over the years. I knew he had gone to law school and was now working in real estate law at a firm in Midtown. At 4 a.m, I texted him asking if we could meet for coffee. We met the next afternoon at a cafe near his office. I brought my folder of documents. Daniel ordered us both lattes and listened without interrupting while I explained everything. The loans, the credit cards, the forged signatures, the lakehouse announcement. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he asked me what I wanted to do about it. I told him I didn't know. He asked if I wanted to report them to the police. I said I didn't think I could do that to my parents. He nodded slowly, then asked a different question. He asked if I wanted them to understand how it feels to lose everything, right when you think you have everything. Something shifted in my chest when he said that. It was like a door I didn't know existed had suddenly opened. I looked at him and I said yes. I wanted them to know exactly how it felt. Daniel spread my documents across the table and started making notes. He explained that what my family had done was multiple counts of identity theft and fraud. In New York, forging signatures on financial documents was a Class D felony. The fact that they had done it repeatedly made it wire fraud at the federal level. If I wanted to go nuclear, I could have them prosecuted and they would likely face jail time. But Daniel suggested something more elegant, something that would hit them where they actually cared. He asked me if I would be willing to sell the lakehouse. I laughed bitterly and said to who. He said to leave that to him. He had a client, a development corporation that had been looking to acquire property on Lake Marlow for a boutique resort project. The land alone was worth triple what I thought because of recent zoning changes I didn't know about. If I was willing to sell, they would pay cash and they would pay immediately. I asked what the catch was. Daniel said the only catch was that the property had to be delivered vacant, completely vacant. No belongings, no occupants, no encumbrances. The corporation would want to take possession immediately upon closing. If anyone was found trespassing after the sale was finalised, they would be removed. I felt my heart start to race as I understood what he was suggesting. I asked him when Mark's wedding was scheduled. He checked his phone and pulled up the invitation that was still public on social media. The wedding was in 6 weeks. The venue listed was the lodge at Lake Marlow. I asked Daniel how fast he could process a sale. He said if I was serious, he could have papers ready to sign in 72 hours and close in 2 weeks. That would be 4 weeks before the wedding. I thought about my mother's face at the engagement party, about Sarah's dismissive smirk, about Mark announcing he was taking my house like it was his right, about all the years of being treated like I was less than like I owed them my life because they happened to raise me, about the debt in my name and the forged signatures and the systematic erosion of everything my grandfather had tried to give me. I told Daniel to draw up the papers. Then I asked him to keep it completely confidential. No one could know until after the sale was finalised. He smiled and said he could do that. He also said that when this was over, he wanted to take me to dinner. A real date. I found myself smiling back and saying yes to that too. The next 2 weeks were surreal. I went to work. I answered my mother's occasional demanding texts about whether I could help pay for wedding flowers or some other expense. I acted completely normal. Meanwhile, Daniel was coordinating everything behind the scenes. The development corporation was thrilled. The price they offered was $1.2 million. more money than I had ever imagined having. On a Tuesday afternoon, I met Daniel at a title company office in White Plains. I signed what felt like 1,000 pages of documents. The corporation's lawyer was there, a severe woman in a perfect suit who barely looked at me. She explained that per the contract possession would transfer at midnight on the date of closing, which was April 15th. After that time, the corporation would have full legal right to remove any trespassers and begin site preparation. She stressed that site preparation meant exactly what it sounded like. They would be bringing in contractors and equipment to prepare for demolition and new construction. I signed everything. The money was wired to a new bank account. Daniel had helped me open one that only I had access to. For the first time in my adult life, I looked at my bank balance and saw 7 figures. It didn't feel real. Daniel walked me out to his car afterward. He told me there was one more thing I needed to do. I needed to change everything about my appearance and my circumstances before the confrontation. If I was going to do this, I needed to show them I was no longer the person they could push around. He said I should think of it like putting on armour. I took a week off work, claiming a family emergency, which was technically true. I went to a high-end salon in Soho where they cut and coloured my hair, gave me a facial, taught me a different way to do my makeup. I went to Bergdorf Goodman and bought clothes I would have never dreamed of owning. A leather jacket that cost $2,000, designer jeans, real jewellery, heels that made me 3 inches taller. I even bought a watch that cost more than my old car. But the most important thing I did was find a lawyer who specialised in financial fraud. With Daniel's help, I compiled every piece of evidence of what my parents had done. Every forged signature, every unauthorised account, every fraudulent transaction. I had it all documented, notarised and prepared in a formal complaint. I made copies. 1 set went to my new lawyer, 1 set I kept. 1 set Daniel held in escrow, and 1 set I prepared to deliver in person. I also sent an anonymous tip to the IRS about my brother's business. Turned out he had been reporting fake business expenses and funneling money through accounts in my name to avoid taxes. That was a federal crime all on its own. During this time, my family kept texting me, asking for help with wedding preparations. My mother wanted me to arrange flowers since I was good with that kind of thing. Sarah needed me to pick up her bridesmaid dress because she was too busy. Mark asked if I could handle some RSVPs. I responded to everything with pleasant, agreeable messages. I told them I would be happy to help however I could. 3 days before the wedding, my mother called and actually asked me directly about using the lakehouse. She phrased it like she was doing me a favour, saying they wanted to have the wedding there to save money, and since I never used it anyway, surely I wouldn't mind. It would mean so much to Mark. It was his dream venue. I took a breath and told her that was such a wonderful idea. I told her I thought it was beautiful that they wanted to celebrate there. I said that Grandpa would have loved to see the family gathered at his beloved house for such a special occasion. My mother actually sounded shocked that I was being so agreeable. She said she was glad I was finally being reasonable about things. She said maybe there was hope for me yet. That phone call nearly broke my resolve. The casual condescension in her voice. The way she spoke to me like I was a child who had finally learned to behave. But I held it together. I told her I loved her and I would see her at the wedding. She said something vague back and hung up. The next 2 days were a blur of activity. Mark and Vanessa's wedding planner was at the lakehouse constantly setting up. They brought in a catering company, a florist, string lights and silk draping and a custom-built arbour for the ceremony, rented chairs and tables, a dance floor, an open bar. My parents spared no expense, probably figuring they were investing in their future, since Mark would supposedly own the place soon. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for Friday night at the house. The wedding was Saturday at 4 p.m. I spent those 2 days in the city preparing. Daniel had coordinated everything down to the minute. The Development Corporation's site manager would arrive at the lakehouse at midnight on Friday. That was the exact moment the property legally became theirs. The local sheriff's department had been notified that there might be trespassers on private property. Everything was in place. Friday evening I drove up to Lake Marlow, but I didn't go to the house. I parked at a hotel 3 miles away and waited. Daniel texted me updates. The rehearsal dinner was happening. About 40 people were there. Mark and Vanessa and both sets of parents, the wedding party, some close family friends. They were all celebrating and toasting and congratulating each other on the beautiful venue. At 11:45 p.m, Daniel texted me that it was time. I got in my car, but instead of my old beat-up Honda, I was driving a BMW I had leased that week. I had spent the afternoon getting ready, and when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognised myself. My hair was styled in loose waves. I was wearing a black designer dress and the expensive leather jacket. Diamond earrings I had bought for myself. I looked like someone who belonged in the world my family pretended to inhabit. I arrived at the lakehouse at 11:58. The long driveway was lit with luminarias and string lights. I could hear music and laughter coming from the back deck that overlooked the lake. I parked behind the catering van and waited. At exactly midnight, I heard them before I saw them, the low rumble of diesel engines. Headlights crested the hill and a convoy of vehicles rolled down the driveway. 2 massive bulldozers on flatbed trucks, several black SUVs, a sheriff's patrol car. They parked in a semicircle facing the house, and their collective headlights flooded the property with harsh white light. The music stopped. People started coming around from the back deck to see what was happening. I got out of my car and stood in the shadows watching. A man in a suit stepped out of the lead SUV. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a no-nonsense expression. Behind him came a woman in business attire, carrying a briefcase. The sheriff, a middle-aged man I recognised from town, got out of his patrol car and approached them. They spoke briefly, looking at papers the woman provided. Then the man in the suit walked toward the house and spoke in a voice clearly accustomed to authority. He announced that this was private property belonging to Marlowe Development Corporation, and he was requesting that everyone vacate the premises immediately. He said they had 1 hour to collect personal belongings and leave, after which any remaining individuals would be charged with criminal trespass. There was a moment of stunned silence, then chaos. My father came barreling around the corner, his face red, his tie loosened from drinking. He started yelling that this was his son's house, that they were having a private event, that whoever these people were could go to hell. The man in the suit remained calm. He told the sheriff to show my father the deed transfer. The sheriff walked over with a manila folder. He showed my father the documents. I watched my father's face go from red to white to purple. He started screaming that it was impossible, that the house belonged to his daughter, that this was some kind of scam. The corporate lawyer spoke up. She said that the house had belonged to Lotus Chen. Past tense. Ms. Chen had sold the property to their client 12 days ago. The sale was legal binding and recorded with the county. As of midnight, anyone on this property was trespassing. My mother appeared, grabbing my father's arm. She looked around wildly and asked where I was. She said there must be some mistake, that I would never do this. Mark pushed through the crowd, Vanessa crying behind him. He was on his phone trying to call me. I watched it ring from where I stood in the darkness. My sister Sarah was filming everything on her phone, probably for Instagram. She looked more confused than upset, like she couldn't process what was happening. The sheriff told everyone they needed to leave. Now. My father demanded to speak to whoever bought the property. The corporate lawyer said her client preferred to remain anonymous, but would be conducting site preparation, beginning immediately. My mother asked what site preparation meant. On cue, the flatbed trucks began unloading the bulldozers. The drivers fired up the engines, and the massive machines rumbled to life. People started screaming. Someone asked if they were going to knock down the house with them still inside. The site manager said they would knock down the decorations first, and that should serve as sufficient motivation for everyone to leave. I chose that moment to step into the light. I walked slowly across the driveway, my heels clicking on the pavement. Every head turned. My mother saw me first. Her mouth fell open. For a second she didn't even recognize me. Then she screamed my name. I stopped about 20 feet away from my family. Daniel got out of one of the SUVs and came to stand beside me. He didn't touch me, but his presence was a wall of support at my back. My mother rushed toward me, almost tripping in her heels. She grabbed my arms and started shaking me, asking what I had done, begging me to tell them this was a joke. I gently removed her hands from my arms. I told her it was no joke. I had sold the house. It was done. My father found his voice. He threatened me. He said I had no right, that the house was for the family, that I would regret this, that he would sue me for everything. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. I handed it to him. He ripped it open and started reading. His face went grey. Inside was a complete accounting of every fraudulent transaction they had made in my name, every forged signature, every unauthorised credit card, every fake loan. I had documentation showing that over the past 8 years they had stolen approximately $300,000 from me and destroyed my credit in the process. The envelope also included a letter from my attorney notifying them that I had filed complaints with the District Attorney's Office and the Federal Trade Commission. The statute of limitations on identity theft in New York was 5 years, but the ongoing nature of their fraud reset the clock. My mother collapsed to her knees in the gravel, wailing. She said I was killing her, that I was destroying the family, that how could I be so cruel? I looked down at her and felt nothing. I told her she had no right to talk to me about cruelty. I reminded her what she had said to me at the engagement party, that I was only invited out of pity, that I was an embarrassment, that I made them look bad. I turned to Mark. He was white-faced, staring at his phone. I asked him if he had gotten the message from Vanessa's father yet. He looked up at me with pure hatred. Apparently the anonymous tip to the IRS had borne fruit faster than expected. Vanessa's father, whose own business was pristine and legitimate, had been informed that his future son-in-law was under federal investigation for tax fraud. The wedding was off. Vanessa was sobbing. She looked at me like I was a monster. She said I had ruined her special day. I told her she should be thanking me for saving her from marrying into a family of con artists. Sarah tried a different approach. She came up to me with tears in her eyes, speaking softly, trying to appeal to sisterhood. She said we could talk about this, that we could work it out, that family was forever. I asked her if she remembered mouthing, "You don't mind, right?" at the engagement party. She went pale. I told her I did mind. I minded all of it. The bulldozers were moving now, their blades raised. Workers in hard hats were approaching the white silk draping that lined the aisle where Mark was supposed to marry Vanessa tomorrow. My mother screamed at them to stop. The site manager ignored her completely. With mechanical efficiency, they began dismantling everything. The arbor came down, the string lights were cut and removed, the rented chairs were loaded onto a truck. The catering company was scrambling to pack up their equipment. My father tried one more time. He walked up to me slowly, hands raised, like he was approaching a wild animal. He said we could talk about this like adults. He said I was upset and he understood, but this was too far. He said that if I went through with this, if I really had them arrested, I would be alone. No family, no support. Did I really want that? I looked him in the eye and I said yes. I told him I had been alone my entire life. Being surrounded by people who used me and disrespected me wasn't family. It was just proximity to cruelty. I said I would rather have no family than a family like this. The sheriff told everyone for the last time that they needed to leave. The wedding planner was crying, trying to salvage what she could. Guests were fleeing to their cars. Vanessa's parents left without a word, taking their daughter with them. The catering company packed up their van and drove away. Mark lunged at me. He called me every horrible name he could think of. He said I was jealous, bitter, that I had always been the weak link, the failure, the disappointment. He said I was nothing without them. Daniel's security guard, a man built like a tank, intercepted Mark before he could reach me. The sheriff stepped in and told Mark that assault wouldn't help his situation. I handed a second envelope to the sheriff. Inside was the evidence of Mark's tax fraud. The sheriff looked it over and nodded. He pulled out his handcuffs and told my father and Mark to turn around. They were being arrested for identity theft and fraud. Anything they said could and would be used against them in court. My mother was beyond words at that point, just making animal sounds of grief and rage. Sarah was filming it all, probably still thinking she could control the narrative somehow. I watched my father and brother get handcuffed and put into the back of the patrol car. My mother ran after them, pounding on the window. The bulldozers were at work now, their blades scraping the ground clean. The beautiful decorations that had taken 3 days to set up were demolished in minutes. It was brutal and efficient and final. I turned to leave. Daniel walked beside me to my car. Behind us, my mother was screaming my name over and over. I didn't turn around. Daniel opened my car door for me and I got in. As I started the engine, one of the bulldozers drove over the custom dance floor, splintering it into pieces. I put the car in reverse and drove away without looking back. The next morning, I woke up in a hotel room that overlooked Central Park. Daniel had arranged it. The sheets were Egyptian cotton and the morning light was golden through the gauze curtains. I ordered room service and ate breakfast in bed, something I had never done in my life. Then I checked my phone. There were 473 messages. Voicemails from my mother begging me to drop the charges. Texts from extended family members I barely knew calling me vindictive and cruel. Emails from my father's lawyer threatening to countersue. Messages from my sister blaming me for destroying her life by association. A few messages from old family friends saying they always knew I was cold. There were also messages from people I didn't expect. Former co-workers who had watched me run myself into the ground and were glad I finally stood up for myself. College friends I had lost touch with who said they were proud of me. Even the wedding planner sent a message saying that what my family did to me was unconscionable, and she hoped I found peace. I blocked every number associated with my family, every social media account, every email address. I had my lawyer set up a cease and desist. If they wanted to communicate with me, it would have to go through legal channels. The criminal charges moved forward. The district attorney was eager to prosecute because identity theft cases with this much documentation were rare. My father and Mark were released on bail, but they were facing serious prison time. My mother wasn't charged criminally, but she was named in the civil suit I filed to recover damages. Their assets were frozen during the investigation. The society wedding that was supposed to cement their status became a public scandal instead. The story made local news: financial fraud, family betrayal, a runaway bride. My family's carefully constructed image collapsed under the weight of their own greed. I didn't watch any of it. I removed my old SIM card from my phone, snapped it in half and threw it in the garbage. Daniel handed me a new phone with a new number that only 3 people had. I took a leave of absence from my job. I didn't need it anymore, but more than that, I needed time to figure out who I was when I wasn't drowning. With Daniel's help, I found a therapist who specialised in family trauma. Her name was Dr. Rivera, and she had kind eyes and didn't judge me when I told her there were days I felt guilty, and days I felt nothing, and days I wanted to burn the whole world down. She told me that all of those feelings were normal, that healing wasn't linear, that choosing yourself over people who hurt you wasn't selfish, it was survival. I started doing things I had never had time or money for. I took a painting class. I joined a gym and actually went. I travelled. I flew to Iceland and watched the Northern Lights. I went to Japan during cherry blossom season and ate at restaurants I would have never splurged on before. I hiked in Patagonia. I learnt to scuba dive in Thailand. Daniel came with me on some of these trips, and slowly, carefully, we built something real between us. Something that wasn't based on obligation or guilt or need, but genuine partnership. It took 18 months for the legal cases to resolve. My father pleaded guilty to avoid trial and got 3 years probation and restitution. Mark got 18 months in a minimum security facility for tax fraud. My mother filed for divorce from my father. Sarah moved to California and changed her last name. The civil suit settled for $200,000, which barely made a dent in what they had actually stolen, but it was something. I didn't go to any of the hearings. I received updates from my lawyer and felt a distant sense of closure each time. But the real healing happened in smaller moments. The first time I went a whole day without thinking about them. The first time someone asked about my family, and I said I didn't have one without feeling sad. The first time I bought myself something expensive just because I wanted it and didn't feel guilty. 2 years after that night at the lakehouse, Daniel and I got married. It was a small ceremony on a beach in Maine with 10 people we actually loved. No family drama, no performance, just vows spoken at sunset and champagne toasts and dancing under the stars. I never spoke to my mother, father, brother or sister again. Sometimes I wondered if that made me cold, if I should have been able to forgive. But then I remembered my mother's face when she told me I was an embarrassment. My father's dismissive tone when I confronted him about fraud. Mark's entitlement as he announced he was taking my house. Sarah's smirk. The systematic way they had used me for years and expected me to be grateful for the abuse. Forgiveness is for people who are sorry. They were only sorry they got caught. 3 years after everything fell apart, I was standing in my new penthouse apartment in Manhattan. I had gone back to work, but on my own terms as a consultant, making twice what I used to. Daniel and I were planning to buy a house in upstate New York, something with land and privacy, a place we could build into a real home. I had friends who actually valued me. I had savings and stability and peace. My phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was my mother. Her voice was small and broken. She said she knew I didn't want to hear from her. She said she understood why I hated them. She said my father was sick. Diabetes complications, possible amputation. She said they had nothing left. The house was in foreclosure. Sarah wouldn't speak to them. Mark got out of prison but was working at a grocery store and refused to help. She said she was calling to ask if I could loan them money for medical bills. I was quiet for a long moment. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who would have drained her account to help, because that's what good daughters do. I thought about my grandfather and the lake house and the life I could have had if they hadn't systematically destroyed it. I thought about all the years of therapy it took to get to where I was now. Then I said no. I told her I hoped my father got the treatment he needed, but it wouldn't come from me. I told her that they made their choices, and now they got to live with the consequences, just like they made me live with the consequences of their choices for years. She started crying, calling me heartless. I told her that wasn't true. I had a heart. I just didn't waste it on people who would bleed it dry. I hung up. I blocked the number. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the darkness. Daniel came out and wrapped his arms around me, asking if I was okay. I leaned back against him and said yes. I actually meant it. Here's what I learned. Blood doesn't make you family. Love does. Respect does. Reciprocity does. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who will never see your worth. Sometimes you have to burn everything down to build something real from the ashes. Sometimes the price of your peace is everyone else's comfort, and that's a trade worth making. They told me not to stay if I couldn't be grateful, so I left. And I took the ground they were standing on with me. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members? What was the final straw for you? And if you're still dealing with people who use you, what's stopping you from setting boundaries? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you. And subscribe, because you never know what story you need to hear until you hear it. Sometimes the universe sends you a message at the exact moment you're ready to receive it.